All right. What's going on, guys? My name is Jake.
I'm Jesus.
This is your Body Comp Prescription, where we help you navigate through all things health and fitness. Hope you're all having a great day. And if you're not already, be sure to follow us on Instagram at bodycomprx. Jesus, take it away for us.
Yes, guys, welcome. Today's episode is going to be episode number 2 of muscle building, a part 2, a sequel, if you will. So if you haven't listened to last week's episode, be sure to check that out because this episode will leave you with a lot of questions that we may have answered previously. And vice versa, right? So yeah, so like how I just said, this episode, it's specifically for those questions that you may have asked yourself or wanted to ask us while listening to last week's episode, but didn't have the opportunity to. Therefore, we're just gonna, jump right into it and, basically answer those questions that someone may have had or is having currently.
So, in order to understand muscle building, we got to start from the top, when we won't go too deep into this because, again, we covered this in the last episode also. But in order for muscle building to happen, you need one of three things, right? You need muscle damage, metabolic stress, or like muscle exhaustion, basically, or muscle tension. You need one of those three things, if not more than one, in order to start the process of muscle building, right? You break your muscle down, you recover through diet, and then whatever else you do to help yourself recover, help your body recover, and then hopefully your muscle will be bigger than it was last time. Cool. So now that we know that, let's just jump right in, right? I know one of the things that we did not talk about last week was compound versus isolation exercises, and this is a pretty big one. A lot of people have probably heard of these and may not even know what these are or any examples of them. So we'll just cover that real quick for you. A compound exercise is something that it's an exercise that has multiple joints involved, right? So something like a bench press or a squat, right? A bench press goes through the elbow joint, the shoulder joint, and you can even argue the wrist as well. So there's multiple joints involved in order to get the exercise done, versus an isolation exercise, which is just one joint for the whole movement. So something like a bicep curl, it's only going through the elbow joint, or like a leg extension, it's only really going through the knee at that point. So now the difference between a compound and isolation exercise.
Yeah, I think one thing that we could talk about too is when talking about compound and versus isolation, it's kind of pros and cons of each, right? So a lot of times I think people do isolation movements because they'll have like muscle imbalances, right? I think I use myself as an example. Jake and I were training not too long ago, and I was doing a overhead shoulder press, right? And when I was doing the movement, Jake was like, "Whoa, like your right side is significantly higher than your left side." And I didn't feel it. The movement felt fine, no pain. But then he took a picture of me, and you clearly see my right shoulder was able to extend a lot more than my left side. And I think so. Someone with that similar situation, isolation movements are beneficial because there's clearly something happening on my left side, or even the right side, that one is taking over, or overcompensating for the other side.
Yeah, that's that probably had, I think in Jesus's particular case, it had to do with dominant side versus non-dominant side. So if you can visualize this real quick, because obviously Jesus couldn't tell because he was doing it, but when I was standing behind him, he was doing a barbell overhead press, and his right shoulder was more elevated, right? So this, if you're watching the video of the podcast, you can kind of see this, right? But if you can't, just imagine shrugging on one side. That's kind of what it looked like. And definitely that was a compound exercise, but in order to help that muscle imbalance that was happening from dominant to non-dominant side, you would definitely maybe want to include some isolation in order to help with that non-dominant side, in order to build more muscle and even out right to left or left to right, and whatever your case may be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then I guess to counter that, like the con for only training isolation, you could suffer from muscle imbalances, because let's just say you're only working certain muscle groups and not working the entire, like for example, if you're only working out certain back muscles and not your entire back, that could lead for some overcompensation of certain muscles and possibly lead to injury.
Yeah, and I think the argument goes further than that too, because if you only do isolation exercises, there's nothing wrong with that, I would say. But um, compound exercises give you a lot of bang for your buck as far as time goes. So because you are using multiple joints, a lot of times you're using more than one muscle group at a time also. So um, in the case of let's say a bench press, right? Again, we're going past the shoulder joint and the elbow joint and stuff. So we're working our chest, but we're also working our shoulders, and we're also working our triceps. But if we wanted to work the chest with an isolation movement, we could do something like a cable fly or a machine fly or something like that, where that only really involves the chest and not other body parts as well. So I think that's why compound movements are a lot of times a main focus for people, because you can get a lot done in the same amount of time without having to pick exercise muscle group. It's more of exercise, hit multiple muscle groups, and then yeah, so on. It kind of helps make your workouts a little bit more efficient in that sense, I would say.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Jake. How
Hmm.
do you, because I'm guessing someone's out there listening to this, right? And they're like, okay, well, clearly both are beneficial. How
Hmm.
do I implement both in my workout split? Or, let's just say today was chest day or arm day. What do I do? Or like, what's better and what's not?
Got it. So I think the general rule of thumb that I would say is that you should start your workout with compound movements, just because those are generally going to be harder than isolation movements. Again, because there's more muscle groups working at the same time. A lot of times you're stronger in compound movements than isolation movements. So you want to get those done first when you have the most energy, and then fill up the rest of your workout with isolation movements. It also, it depends on what your split looks like and stuff like that. But I would say that's the best way to go, because again, doing that when you have the most energy, you'll get a lot more, again, bang for your buck by doing compounds first versus doing them last. And then also, one thing that I want to point out here too is that in the first episode we talked a lot about intensity techniques and stuff like that. I think it's a lot better to implement intensity techniques with isolation movements. So once you're done with your compounds, moving on to isolations, doing things like those drop sets, those supersets that we talked about, so that way um, you still get a lot out of the movement. But
Yeah.
doing those intensity techniques with compound movements can be a little bit more dangerous sometimes, because of um, all of the movements that are happening at one time versus only one movement happening during an isolation exercise. So just wanted to throw that out there to kind of tie it back into the first episode, or the first
Yeah.
part.
Yeah, that's really good. I kind of also wanted to talk about so you were just talking about intensity. So
Mhm.
you want to jump into like RPE, because I feel like RPE kind of like plays a role in that, right?
Yeah. So if you haven't heard of RPE before, there's several different scales that you can use in order to measure RPE. RPE is an acronym for rate of perceived exertion. It's basically a scale that allows you to judge the difficulty of the exercise.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really good way to explain it. But generally, for um, people who don't care about the differences between scales, it's basically just a 1 to 10 scale. So if 1 being really easy, 10 being like impossible, like I physically cannot get this done.
Yeah.
um and the the reason this is important is because this is a good way to, excuse me, um help measure your progressive overload, I would say, because um it that makes it a little bit more objective in a sense, right? So if I'm curling 30-pound dumbbells, but it's an RPE 8, right? Meaning it's like pretty hard. I only have a couple of reps left in the tank before I hit failure.
Yeah.
That means that's probably a pretty good weight for me to be at, you know? But if I was curling 30-pound dumbbells and the RPE was like 3 or 4 or something like that, then obviously that would kind of like let you know that you should be doing something else, either bump up the weight or do a drop set again, do like some of those intensity techniques that we keep bringing up. So RPE isn't super important in my opinion, but it is a really good way to help measure difficulty of your exercises and your programming to kind of let you know if you should be changing anything up.
Yeah, because that kind of ties into when training to failure, right? Because I think I don't think training to failure is necessary for every single movement or every one of your exercises for every single workout.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it has its time and place. I could argue it has its time and place, right?
Yeah.
So I think so. RP is a good way for you to, be real with yourself and be like, what I'm doing, whatever it is, a squat, curl, push up, is it hard or is it easy? Is my RPE scale 1? Because if it's a 1 or 3, and your goal of your workout is to build muscle, right? You know that I would say you should probably give yourself around 7 or 8, because like I said, I don't think you should be training for failure. I don't think you should keep going until you could physically no longer can't, because I think that leads to other detrimental things that we'll get into some other day. But you shouldn't definitely be going into failure. I want to bring up Jake, I don't know if you remember this, but in school we learned something called the 2 for 2 rule.
2 for 2. No, I don't remember that actually.
So this kind of goes, it's when you're training and and this kind of ties into progressive overload, because it goes here. I'm reading this verbatim, so I don't misinterpret this, but it says, if the athlete can perform 2 or more repetitions over his or her assigned repetition goal in the last set in 2 consecutive workouts for a given exercise, weight should be added for that exercise for the next training session.
Okay.
Right. And I thought this was a really cool rule, because when you're training, I think a lot of people, maybe newbies, because I think if you've been at the gym for a while, you kind of have an idea of this, but for those who wanting to get in or don't have much experience, they're like, well, I don't know if this is the right enough weight. I don't know if I should go up. And I like this rule because it's kind of a good foundation for when to increase your weight, right? Because if you're able to, if you finish a set, and you're about to move on to a different exercise and you're like, yeah, I probably could have hit another 10 more reps, then the load should have been increased, correct?
Yeah. I did not remember that, learning that, but I would say, just judging off of what it was described as, it's a pretty good rule to follow, to be honest.
And I've always it's just one of those things. I don't necessarily think it was like we were ever tested on it. I think it was probably like on a PowerPoint, and I read it, and then it just always stuck with me, because I was like the way it was worded, I was like, perfect, because I think a lot of even myself, when I was just starting to get into it, and I was like, well, I mean, I've been lifting this way for some time, yes, it is getting easier, but I wasn't sure of when to increase my load, right?
That's a really good example. Yeah. Sure. Cool. Why don't we hop into something else that I know we did not talk about last week, which was soreness. A lot of people really heavily concern themselves with soreness, right? They work out for the point of getting sore, not necessarily because they like it, but because they think it's necessary in order to achieve muscle growth. And we're here to debunk that, right? We, again, going back to stuff that we've learned, and something you may have heard about is called DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, which is basically, being sore for several days past your original training date. So maybe, if you train legs, you're not necessarily super sore the next day, you feel fatigued, but you're not sore. And then day 2, 3, and 4, you feel soreness. But getting back into soreness in general, a lot of people carry themselves away with saying, oh, I'm super sore, I had a really good workout, I definitely am going to build more muscle than Joe Schmo over there, because he's just kind of like messing around, and he's not training to failure, he's not creating as much damage as I am.
Hmm.
But you don't need soreness in order to start muscle growth, right? Because tying this back into the beginning, right, we talked about there are 3 ways that you can begin muscle growth, right? Muscle damage being one of them, which usually leads to soreness. But you can also do it through muscle tension by like increasing your weights and stuff. And then again, metabolic stress or muscle exhaustion. So, that's why you shouldn't necessarily focus on how sore you are after a workout. If you are sore, then yes, it's an indicator that, yeah, maybe you did have a really good workout. But we're
Hmm.
here to say that it's not everything.
Yes, yes, correct. And I like how you said it's not very indicative of whether that workout was good or not. Sometimes just the intensity, or maybe that specific workout day you increased your intensity, right? And it caused you to be sore. Because I think a good example is here those who like to go running, right? The first time, let's say the very first time, if you haven't ran in like months, the first time you go running, you're gonna be sore, right? You'll be sore for the next few days. But after you've been running for some time now, you go on a normal Monday, Wednesday evening on a run, you're not sore anymore. Yes, your legs maybe get fatigued, but you're not sore. But does that mean that does that mean you walked through the entire run, or that run wasn't successful? No, it just we our muscles adapt, and we I think muscle soreness is really good for us, right? But
Mhm.
unfortunately, if you're training to work out to feel sore, that's not very effective either.
Yeah, it's not necessary, I think is a better way to put that, just because it's not the only way, again, in order to build muscle, you know.
Yeah, yeah, I think that kind of ties into we mentioned this as well in the last previous episode, but we talked about mind muscle connection, right?
Mhm.
And I think this is perfect to talk about, because I think it's better about the quality of your workout than the quantity of your workouts, right? Like you could say you go to gym 7 times a week,
Mhm.
but if the quality isn't there, and you're not feeling, you know, or seeing any physical gains, then is it very like, are you actually making improvements?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think that um that's another thing too, like the volume of your training. But as
Mhm.
far as mind muscle connection goes, um the reason this is so important is because um one, you're getting greater control over your muscle groups. So you don't necessarily need to like adjust your weights or adjust the amount of sets, reps, stuff like that, because if this is something that you can master, and it's different for everybody, some people have better mind muscle connections with like their biceps than they do, let's say, like their glutes or something, right? um but the better you can get at that, it makes it adds an extra layer of like what's the word that I'm looking for here, like quality almost, like it. I don't know what word I'm trying to say here, but like it makes it it's something that you get over time, like it's not something that usually most people that just begin the gym or just begin working out can implement. But I would say the sooner that you get that done, I think you will have significantly greater muscle growth gains. Um, because again, that's one more variable that you can manipulate in order to make your workouts harder or more effective, if that's a more friendly word, you know?
Yeah, yeah, I think
So,
that's kind of you know a good example of that is like, a lot of these athletes don't train like near the 1 rep max, right? Or the max amount of weight they could lift. A lot of
mhm,
the very strong guys or girls, you'll see them work out with lower weight, but the lower weight is just equally, if not more effective than when they're lifting heavy weight, correct?
Yeah, so a way to help visualize that is, let's say we're talking about a bench press, right? If I can rep 225, 2 plates, right? If I can rep out 225 pounds, but I'm only doing, you know, like 10 seconds worth of work versus cutting the weight in half to like 135 and controlling and literally feeling my muscle fibers contract and shorten and lengthen again, that has a lot more significance because again, we're trying to get muscle growth, not necessarily for strength. So weight doesn't always make the biggest difference, and sometimes we have to like kick our ego to the curb a little bit when it comes to that, because you know, mind muscle connection can be a lot more beneficial than I think people give it credit for, and only people that, you know, develop these can tell you that. So you know, I think that's why we're trying to put that out there for you, so that way if you can start practicing this sooner, it may help you even more than, you know, you just running your course through the gym and then in a couple of years hopefully getting better at this. Because there are people who go to the gym and have been going to the gym for 20, 30 plus years and have no idea what mind muscle connection is. And I think that's a singular attribute that can, you know, point to plateaus and stuff like that, like muscle building plateaus. So just keep that in mind. I think mind muscle connection isn't everything, but I definitely think it's super helpful. And again, one of those kind of underrated things.
Yeah, real quick before we before we call it a day, but I want to give my personal advice on, for those who are wondering how do you achieve mind muscle connection. My
Mm-hmm.
personal advice on, where to start, I think is, we mentioned this last episode, but whatever movement, let's just say doing a bicep curl, right? If you focus on the bicep curl, the entire movement, you're not just banging out 10 reps, you're actually going slow and feeling your muscles contract, how Jake said, curling the dumbbell and then bringing it down at a slow, even pace, I think is a good place to start, right? Would you agree?
Yeah, and I think, God, I had a really good example. It's focusing on, because you can get from point A to point B several different ways, right? And your body is really efficient, so it's going to do that however it pleases.
Mm-hmm.
But focusing on the how, like while it's happening, can really increase your mind muscle connection. So if you know you're doing a bicep curl, you know you need your biceps, right? But there's a lot of people out there who just know the dumbbell has to get closer to my shoulder at the end of the movement. So that's when like the hip swing comes into play, throwing your back into it, all that kind of stuff, like technique errors come into play when if you're more strict on your technique and you focus on the how you get the weight from point A to point B. I think that'll be a really good way to improve your mind muscle connection.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. Great advice there.
Sweet, thanks.
Yeah, all right. I mean, did you have anything else you wanted to include?
I think just really quick to wrap this up, I think a really common question that I get, and maybe even you get as well, is how many sets should I be doing to, achieve muscle growth, right? How many sets should I be doing, right? Usually reps comes alongside that as well. But I just want to cover this really quick because I'm sure there are people out there that have this question. If you really want to know, it's pretty consistent in the research that says that 10 to 20 sets per week per muscle group is a good range to be in order to achieve muscle growth, right? And I'm not talking including your warm-up sets and all that kind of stuff. 10 to 20 working sets per muscle group should get you there, but obviously this varies based upon your how long you've been training and stuff like that. So if you wanted an official number, 10 to 20 sets is what you can, you know, try and look at. So like if I'm trying to grow my biceps again, right? We'll just keep using biceps to keep it clear. If I wanted to grow my biceps, I would need to do something between 10 and 20 sets per week in order to grow my biceps. Now, it's better to, in my opinion, to split that up into maybe 2 sessions as opposed to doing 20 sets worth of biceps in, you know, one day. And that's just simply because there's only a certain amount of damage that can be done within a single workout, to the point where it's like you're just mindlessly going through movements now. So, you know, splitting that up between the week is a really good way to get that total volume. Again, I don't think it's something that you need to focus on super heavily, but again, I know this was probably a question that a lot of people were curious about, like, well, how many sets should I do for X body part? This is kind of like the easy answer to it, if that's something that you want to focus on. But again, you know, we always preach about, you know, not mindlessly going through movements, you know, again, controlling the weight, controlling the intensity, you know, working on your mind muscle connection. Now you know about RPE, you know, and stuff like that, you know. So if you wanted to know about sets, that was your answer, but it's not everything, again, in my opinion.
Yeah, perfect. I was just gonna mention that too. I don't think it's the end all be all answer to like how many sets or how you should be training them. I think another good thing besides following that like template of how many reps and how many sets I should be doing for per muscle group, you could also be the own judge too. Because if you physically can't get to 10, it's not the end of the world if you can't get to 10. But if you're hitting somewhere between like 7, 8, but they're quality sets, then you're solid right there.
Yeah, again, and that like ties back into like your personal abilities, so like you may not even need 10, especially if you're a beginner, right?
Yeah.
But if you're an intermediate or an advanced lifter, then you're probably going to be on the upper end of this, like the 15 to 20, maybe even 25 sets per week, which sounds like a lot. But, when you've been training for, 15, 20 plus years, your muscle is adapting with you all that time as well. So, but yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about today?
No, that was all.
Cool. Yeah, I think this was a really good way to wrap up a part 2 of muscle building. Hopefully, we answered a good few more of your questions if these were questions that you had. Muscle building is super important to a lot of us, so that's why we felt like we needed to make multiple parts to make sure we covered a lot of everything. And if we still missed something, let us know down in the comments, and we'll definitely tackle that in a future episode, and we'd love to cover that. So ask your questions down below, but if you're all good, Jesus.
Yep.
All right, then until next time, guys. Peace.
Yeah.